Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you once again to this very special World Economic Forum here at the Dead Sea. We're going to be talking today about the geopolitical outlook. My name is Hadley Gamble. I am CNBC's anchor and Middle East correspondent based right here, well, actually, just over the border in Abu Dhabi. I want to kick off by introducing our esteemed guests, the Minister of Foreign Affairs here in Jordan, Ayman al-Safadi. Your Excellency, welcome. Also, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Oman, Mr. Yusuf bin Alawi bin Abdullah. Excellency, welcome. We're also joined on stage by Sigrid Kaag. She's the Minister for Foreign Trade and Development Cooperation of the Netherlands. And also the Minister of National Defense of Lebanon, Elias. Welcome, sir. Now, one of the purposes, of course, of this session is to provide an overview of the geopolitical realignments that are going to have a direct impact on the investment case for every country in the Middle East and North Africa. And frankly, whether it's the conflicts that lead to migrant crises, newfound energy independence for many of the countries represented here that will frankly give them the opportunity for their own foreign policy, perhaps even for the very first time. And also, of course, the continuing religious fault lines that are being drawn. All of us are going to feel the impact, whether you're here in the region, whether you're sitting in Europe, whether you're in Asia or in the United States. And obviously, this does have a direct impact on your willingness and frankly, your willingness and your ability to invest in the future of countries like Jordan. I want to kick off with the Foreign Minister, Mr. al-Safadi. When we talk about what's been happening over the last 10 years or so with regards to the region, when we look at US foreign policy, for example, many people have said that, whether it's the resurgence of Iran, whether it's the migrant crisis, what we're seeing in Syria, the rise of extremist groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, for example, and even, frankly, the surge of Saudi Arabia as a major dominant political force, all of this has to do with what's been happening with US foreign policy. And the question, of course, is, what are America's goals here? Because frankly, some people would say that the administration's approach to the realities of the region isn't necessarily the right one.
Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to welcome you all to Jordan once again. It's a pleasure to have you. And what has been happening in the last 10 years, Hadley, is that we've been sinking deeper into crises. I think the biggest failure was, again, to employ realistic policies that would look at the crisis for what they are and then articulate comprehensive strategies that will enable us to get over them. From the Palestinian and Israeli conflict, which we continue to say it is the key conflict in the region, and all our efforts to bring about comprehensive peace and stability will not really succeed unless we're able to solve that oldest of conflicts in the region on the basis that the whole world recognize are the only path forward, which is the two-state solution that would allow for the emergence of an independent sovereign Palestinian state on June 4, 1967, lines with East Jerusalem as capital, living side by side, recognized and secure Israel, as is the premise of the Arab Peace Initiative, which has been on the table since 2002 as a comprehensive offer from all Arab countries, endorsed by all Muslim countries, to bring about that comprehensive peace. Everything in the region is interconnected. We have witnessed in the last years new crises developing, whether in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen. And I think the underlying point here is that we have to look with a holistic approach to all those issues. The world has been tackling the challenge of terrorism over the past few years. And we say, yes, we need to fight the terrorists militarily. We need to be resilient from a security perspective. But the key success factor here is to address conditions of despair and lack of horizons upon which radicals thrive and which they use to propagate their agenda of hate and rejecting the other. So that means we have to address regional crises with a way that would allow for the emergence of just solutions to all those crises. And of course, we need to tackle the narrative. But our ability to be more convincing in countering that hate ideology would be strengthened enormously by addressing, again, conditions of despair and failure and anarchy upon which terrorism thrive. The region, we know what the problems are, and we know the impact. And as His Majesty said earlier, what happens here affects the entire world. So I think it is in the interest of all of us in the international community to do whatever we can to possibly acknowledge what is number one, what is the key sources of the problems, and then work together collectively to address them. Piecemeal approaches do not work anymore. Looking at the problems from one narrow angle doesn't work anymore. The U.S. is a major player. Every crisis in the region would benefit enormously from an active, positive U.S. engagement, and we encourage that engagement. But I think it is our duty towards our people, towards our region, towards the whole world, is to say things for what they are and the way they are. And that is to be able to employ realistic approaches to solving these problems. And you cannot ignore facts on the ground. You cannot ignore that there's an occupation that needs to be ended in order for peace to be achieved. You cannot ignore that there's a crisis in Syria that, yes, has quieted down in terms of military activity, but in terms of its implications, they are still pretty much strong. Talk about refugees, 1.3 million Syrians in Jordan alone. The impact of that is beyond our capacity to shoulder alone. And when we talk about refugees, providing them with a dignified life, meeting their needs, is not just a humanitarian answer to the problem. It is an investment in our collective security because, again, the past 10 years have proven how interconnected our security is. Europe was shocked by the waves of migration that crossed the Mediterranean going into it. But in reality, the number of refugees who crossed into Europe are very small in comparison to the number of refugees that we had to take in Jordan. So when we say the problem is still there, work on it, make sure that we all work together. We're doing that. Yes, we have a humanitarian responsibility, but also we have a responsibility towards our own collective security.
Your Excellency, though, you do mention that it needs a holistic approach, and you recognize the United States' role in that. But with frankly, the moves by the Trump administration to move the embassy to Jerusalem and to seemingly ignore the roots of this crisis, does that mean that the realities, frankly, it's Washington losing its ability to influence policy at this point?
Well, I mean, again, the U.S. will continue to have a key role. It is the superpower of the world. It does have a key role. What we do is that we engage.
But not represented today.
We engage them positively. We engage them frankly, and we engage them honestly. When they made the decision on Jerusalem, His Majesty was very clear that this is something that we will not and cannot and did not accept because Jerusalem is a final status issue. Is Jerusalem by international law is occupied Palestinian territory. You cannot preempt final negotiation status in violation of what the international law says. The same thing when it comes to the Golan Heights. I think not just Jordan, but the whole Arab world, as articulated by the latest summit in Tunis, the Golan Heights is an occupied Syrian territory. And we say this decision is wrong on more than one perspective, in perspective of international law, in perspective of what's right, and in perspective of what are the implications for the future. International law clearly says the acquisition of land by force is something that is unacceptable. That is embodied in 242, that's embodied in 497. In terms of right and what's right and wrong, the whole world recognizes that the Golan Heights is Syrian territory. So to come and say, I'm taking it away simply because I feel it is in my interest, then that gives a free license to everybody and come and do the same. And in terms of implications, it only deepened that environment of frustration and hopelessness that is going to engulf all of us in more conflict and more tension unless we're able to stop and say, let's reassess and let's see what the problems again are and what the solutions are. And I think the solution is known to all of us. We've been working with this conflict for decades now. Everybody knows what the answer is. What's needed is the will to move on the path towards that ultimate solution that will bring about the comprehensive peace. And by the end of the day, it is what people on the ground are willing to live with. The Palestinians want a state. Anything short of that is something that the Palestinian people are not going to accept. Can you impose such any solution that they do not accept? The answer is no. Proof, decades of conflict have not been able to give them, to give up that right. So again, we are a country that knows the consequences of conflict. We've been at the receiving end of every crisis in the region, from Palestine to Syria to terrorism. And we've lived with the impact. And therefore, when we speak about peace, we speak with the credibility of a country that has really invested in peace and a country that has really been given a very unfair share as a result of the failure of all of us in the international community to come and do the right thing and again, work systematically, methodologically towards a solution.
And speaking of what people are willing to live with, I want to move on to His Excellency Minister Saab in terms of Lebanon. The Lebanese people seemingly have been willing to live without a government for long periods of time. They've been willing to get along in that sense, but it hasn't been very productive, and certainly the economy has felt the strain of it. Today, of course, you're dealing with something else. We saw in the national newspaper actually a story that was singling out Mr. Nabi Berri as someone that the United States may potentially be sanctioning in the coming days. And there's certainly a lot of conversation right now, I'm sure at home, about what that could mean for Lebanon. Do you feel that the United States, when it comes to sanctioning Iran, has really put Lebanon in the crosshairs here? And frankly, do you feel like you're a victim of US foreign policy?
First, please allow me to agree with what His Excellency Safadi has mentioned about the origin of the problem in the Middle East, which is the Palestinian-Israeli situation. And if this is not resolved, if we don't grant the Palestinians the land and the country, this problem is going to go on and on. We thought in the beginning that this is the only crisis in the region. Then we went through phases. We went through Arab Springs, we went through ISIS, Daesh, Qaeda. Things are changing, and the conflict is getting bigger. And this conflict, by the way, will not remain in the region. This conflict can be exported because we are now dealing with a different situation.
Like Hezbollah in Venezuela, exporting?
And like ISIS, we're dealing with a situation where terrorism has no border. We're dealing with a situation where this thing is ideology. If you go and, like what's happening in Syria right now, and say we have won the military war against ISIS in Syria, does that mean the war is over? I want to just give you a small story, a short story about what we witnessed in Lebanon in the 1990s after the Chechenian war and the Afghani war. Once this was over, some people came back, returned back to Lebanon, Lebanese people. We didn't know that they were fighting with Al-Qaeda back then. And they went underground. 4 or 5 years later, they formed a cell. And they killed the first Lebanese army officer in the north of Lebanon. And then Nahr al-Barid happened, and then the terrorist organization started to grow. And we realized that these people may have lost the war in Chechnya, but the ideology stayed. They went back home, and they created another problem, which became a bigger problem. Why am I saying that? Because yes, now we may be winning the war in Syria against ISIS militarily, but there are thousands of those terrorists that are going to head home somewhere. And this somewhere is not Lebanon or Jordan or Syria or Iraq. This somewhere could be anywhere in the world. So we are going to be facing a bigger challenge as an international community. And I think it's only through cooperation and talks and dialogue that we can resolve this issue.
You're talking about international terrorist organizations. The U.S., of course, has designated Hezbollah as an international terrorist organization. Of course, they are a member of your government. They are considered a political party in your country. Do you feel that the U.S. is victimizing or making a victim of Lebanon by pushing forward with sanctions?
Yes, I believe the policy on Lebanon with that regard is not going to be paying off, because in Lebanon, it's a mosaic country. In Lebanon, we have to deal with Lebanon in a different way. The Lebanese people know how to handle the situation internally without creating another civil war in Lebanon. No one should or could be pressing us in one direction that may create instability in my country. We are talking with the Americans, we are having dialogues with them, and we are explaining the situation. Hezbollah, they are Lebanese. They're part of the Lebanese community. They have mayors, they have elected members in the parliament, they are in the government. They belong to a religion, Islamic religion, and Shiites. We also have Sunnis, we have Christians. Lebanon is a mosaic country, and we have to live together at the end of the day. It doesn't mean everybody agrees with everybody on their policy.
But would you then deny, sir, that in terms of Tehran funding Hezbollah, that they're making the region less safe as a result of that?
In terms of Iran
funding Hezbollah coming out of Tehran, does that not make the region less safe?
You're putting it as if Hezbollah is the only problem in the country, in the region. you're forgetting about ISIS. You're forgetting about those terrorists that created a
Not at
big
all. We had
problem
Hezbollah before we
in
had
Syria,
ISIS.
in Tunis, in Libya. You're talking about something that is much, much bigger in the region. And unless this is resolved in the region, I don't think we can just pinpoint and say Hezbollah is the obstacle or is the problem in the region. I am not defending Hezbollah. I'm saying what we need to do is to open dialogue to see how do we communicate amongst each other to end this conflict that exists in the region. And once we agree on a settlement, and I want to go back to point one, where Minister Safadi started. If we find a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian situation, conflict, then I think everything else will be easier to deal with. The recent statement about the Golan Heights as well also is rejected, because no one can grant a land that does not belong to him or her. The land is an occupied Syrian land. You may agree or disagree with the Syrian government, but you cannot agree or disagree on who is the land belongs to. All United Nations resolutions, even now 2254, talks about the sovereignty of the Syrian territory. So when we talk about things like that, we are talking about finding a permanent solution where all the countries in the region will understand how this will be resolved. And after that, you can talk about the military presence of any group that is not the official, the army or the official armed forces of any country.
I just want to bring in Jordan's foreign minister again on this, because we talk about the Israeli-Palestinian issue and that being the great destabilizer, the major sticking point from which all other problems in the region devolve. But what about Iran versus Saudi Arabia? What is the conflict there doing to the rest of the region? No doubt it's making it less safe.
Look, again, Iran is part of this region. What Saudi Arabia wants, what Jordan wants, what the whole Arab world wants, what's in the interest of the whole international community is for relations to be based on the internationally established principles of non-interference in the affairs of others and respect for the sovereignty of the other. And this is the premise of what could be a way to address this conflict. We have some issues with Iran interventionism in the region. We've said that, we've spoken about that. But again, you cannot look at that in isolation. And when Iran speaks about it being the defender of Arab and Muslims in Jerusalem, if you solve the issue of Jerusalem, you will deny Iran that rhetoric. So again, it comes back to that. What does Iran do in order for it to gain popularity in the region? It looks at the conflicts that have not been solved. It looks at the injustice to which the Palestinians have been subjected, and it says, I'm there to defend. So if we're able to solve that, I think a lot of the arguments will be taken away from anybody who is looking at those conflicts as means to propagate whatever interest that they have. Ultimately, with Iran is a challenge to some of our brotherly countries. We do not accept any encroachment on their security and safety. We say that very openly, but then again, we believe that we should be able to not create another conflict in the region, but on the contrary of that, we should solve or prevent another conflict in the region from developing by engaging in a conversation that would allow for relations to be based on mutual respect and non-interference.
How do you get to that point when you have a United States administration changing every 4 to 8 years with completely different policies with regards to Iran and Saudi Arabia, the largest economy in the region versus a regional behemoth?
Look, we have to remain engaged because, what is the alternative to engagement? It's a vacuum. If you have a vacuum, every radical force in the region would try and fill it. There are solid arguments to be made. We make those arguments over and over again. We have a continued engagement with the U.S. We talk and they talk, and
but sometimes over each other.
We agree to disagree. And when Vice President visited Jordan a while ago, and he met with His Majesty, and he went out and he gave a press conference, and he said, "We agreed with His Majesty to disagree on Jerusalem. We have excellent ties with the U.S. We're friends. We talk." But then again, what friends do is tell the truth to each other. And that's what His Majesty has been doing. That's what Jordan has been doing, is to say it as it is. We all have an interest in overcoming the crises from which the region is suffering. And to get there, we have to have an open, frank conversation and put things on the table as they are. which means we sometimes agree and we sometimes disagree, and when we disagree, we have a logical argument for that disagreement, and we have principles and we have positions that have been established and positions that have proven to be right, and we say it. And again, let me say, when Jordan speaks about peace, it speaks with a lot of credibility. Jordan, after all, has always been a voice for moderation. Jordan has always been an active member of the international community in terms of pursuing better relations and building bridges of interaction and conversation. So that said, we have our views, we make them clear. There is no alternative to engagement. We have to keep talking.
Minister Kaag, when you talk about engagement in the region, where is Europe? I mean, granted, everybody in Brussels is worried about Brexit, but certainly most of the people in this room would want and expect more engagement from Europe here, because when there's a conflict in Libya, everyone comes to the table, breaks it, doesn't fix it, and runs away. Now we have more conflict in Libya, for example, then that's just a small example. Where's Europe?
I think Europe is around, Europe is engaged, but never at the level, and that's sometimes because the parties don't want it. Let's say Israeli-Arab conflict, for instance, Europe has never been an active negotiator because one of the parties is not necessarily asking the European Union to take on a role. So if you look at Libya, the European Union, I think, is more actively there, on Syria, certainly in the case of Yemen, but we often support the international actors, in this case mostly UN-led efforts. We want them to succeed, and the European Union mostly supports actually the humanitarian track, some of it political. Europe is engaged, but we're also a partner on a bilateral level, the Union as well as, let's say, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, to all these countries. We have framework agreements, we have negotiations, we have association agreements. I think I'd like to take the discussion also a little bit, not just only to the crises, but in all countries, one way or another, the institutions have, to a lesser or greater degree, failed generations of their own citizens. There is a need for a social contract, irrespective of the conditions of the country, be it a failed state, failing state, crisis, new crisis. Nothing or not everything can be relayed to the Israeli-Arab conflict. I mean, the successive generations have grown up in a confined space, no jobs, no future, limited investment, a public sector that is bloated and cannot create the jobs for a new generation. I would venture that many young people in the region today don't affiliate so much to the rallying cry of the Arab-Israeli conflict. At an emotional level, they may do. They want to know what their government, their country is doing for them to help them build new lives. So we're talking.
We've talked so often about this, about the potential for a Marshall Plan for Europe.
Yeah.
But at the same time, who's going to take the leadership on that? Because it doesn't seem as if the United States
like
is.
any other
Will it be Europe?
No, because leadership ultimately always has to come from the countries within. And I think Minister Safadi speaks to that. The Prime Minister of Jordan speaks to the macroeconomic reform plan for Jordan. King Abdullah does so. In Lebanon, there is a big plan. Leadership on reform, on improvement, social progress needs to come from within countries. The European Union can either support politically, can invest, which we're doing, but ultimately, we're not in a neo-colonial era, thank God. This is not the case. This is for the people of the region to determine, but which is where citizenship and social contracts come in. If you speak on conflicts, yes, we would love the European Union, I think, to play a more active role, but as you know, on many issues that divide precisely this region, the European Union doesn't necessarily always have the same views. You see that on our conferences. On the two-state solution, however, there is an EU position, and we are supportive of many of the issues that Minister Safadi has just highlighted. When it comes to Iranian, the nuclear deal, the European Union is in support of the nuclear deal. We have not opted out. We are looking for dialogue. But, for instance, we have our own stressors with the United States at the moment, be it on tariffs and on trade. So I think the disengagement of the US as a very important, critical, historical player in this region, I think is of a concern to all of us. And it's important we remain in dialogue, and we seek also the upholding of international law and international humanitarian law. That is definitely an EU position, and you will see that reflected in our council positions. Now, the non-permanent members, Germany and Belgium, are doing that alongside the UK and France. So international law, maintaining of international law and order is very critical. That is the voice of Europe. But are we a superpower? Not in that sense, no. Are we an economic power? Yes. And in today's world, 21st century, if we're talking the fourth industrial revolution, I think there is a lot more that could be offered by Europe, but we do this in partnership with the region. I think that's extremely important. And the EU Arab States, or the League of Arab Summit that recently took place, spoke to all the issues that were shared. Politics, economics, but also social dividends. because the social dividend, the social human capital of this region cannot be ignored, it cannot be put in the fridge waiting for political solutions. They need to come together, they need to be maintained, and they need to be, it's an intricate embroidery. It's tatris.
And just bringing in Oman's foreign minister as well, sir, when we talk about building bridges in the region, Oman, of course, has been a catalyst for those kinds of bridges, whether it be between the United States and Iran in the past, or other countries as well. But one of the questions, of course, going forward is going to be whether or not Oman, for example, can exert that kind of brokerage or leadership in those conversations going forward, given the tenor of things coming out of Washington right now. Recently, there were reports that there will be a more engaged and heavier presence of U.S. Military in the Persian Gulf, and that was at the request of your government around the Persian Gulf area. That, of course, is the Strait of Hormuz. We're talking about a fifth of the world's oil exports going through this area. So this is about energy independence, energy security, as well as the security of the region. What are you worried about there? Are you worried about Iran, or are you worried about someone else?
In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful.
So the audience can use the headphone, and I will speak slowly so the interpreter can catch up. Anna.
Of course, I have listened to what His Excellency the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Jordan and the Minister of Defense in Lebanon have said, and I totally agree with them. I agree with everything they have said. However, I do not agree with the expectations. Because, of course, these expectations remain unclear. Of course, what we are commonly listening to when it comes to discussing the main conflict between Palestine and Israel. Of course, as you all know, Israel was established after World War II, and an agreement between, of course, the winners of the Second World War. And of course, this was a source of conflict with, between Israel on one hand and the Arab states on the other hand. And this conflict has gained momentum. It has degenerated, leading into the wars of 1948, the 1967, the 1973. So we've had a series of wars. And then ISIS and Al-Qaeda have seen the light. And these are, of course, different types of conflicts and wars. And now, we are looking for new means and new possibilities which could make sure that the Middle East becomes a stable and a developed region. But maybe we did not understand why is Israel occupying the West Bank, is occupying the Golan Heights, and it used to occupy Gaza as well. And it used to occupy as well Sinai. And then Sinai was liberated, and Israel ended its occupation of Gaza. However, it remained in the Golan Heights and in the West Bank as well. We wonder and we ask ourselves, why? Why? I am intimately convinced, and I am fully and personally convinced, as a person and as a representative of an Arab state, and as a person who has actually been through all the problems in the region, who has accompanied all the conflicts in the region. So for 48 years of my life, we have been witnessing all these crises. And when I became a public official and a public figure in charge of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Sultanate of Oman, I was as well bearing witness to all these conflicts. And this is not in anyone's defense, but I have to say the following. The Israelis were capable of having everything from the international community: the political support, the economic support, and the military support. Which means that, bottom line, they have all the means for pulling the trigger and for having all the sources of power. But why? I think that this is a crucial point that we need as well to underline, and that needs to be part of the different issues that have to be taken into account. Israel, despite its full power and despite everything we've said, is not assured as to its future and doesn't feel secure because it's a non-Arab country living in an Arab neighborhood, surrounded by 400 million persons. And it is not secure, it doesn't feel secure about the continuity of its presence in the region. And I think that we as Arabs, we have to be capable of looking into this. And we need as well to actually put an end to these fears.
It's right to exist.
بإجراءات
This has to take place using measures and by means of course, real agreements between us as Arab countries and Israel, and between whoever is supporting Israel. And this is why, unless we do all this, and unless we take an initiative without being pushed by anyone into this initiative, and unless we look into how we can encourage Israel to look or to feel that it is part of this neighborhood, of this region, of this Middle East region. And unless, of course, all the common interests are taken into account and to make sure that its interests confide into the region's interests, because without this, and without, of course, alleviating the feeling by the Israelis or putting an end to the Israeli feeling that they are in a region that is actually threatening their future, which is not true.
To clarify, so you're saying that the best end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is, in fact, recognizing Israel's right to exist, therefore putting away these security fears that, frankly...
not recognizing themselves to feel that there are no threats to their own future.
They probably won't feel that way unless you recognize them as a sovereign state. I just want to bring in the foreign minister of Jordan as well, because I think he has a comment.
I didn't finish.
Go for it. Continue.
We see now, نرى الآن,
So we now see that unless this role is taken, and this role is actually undertaken by the head of the Palestinian state, President Mahmoud Abbas. And he's the one who's playing this role. and Israel and the Palestinians have agreed on building the infrastructure of the Palestinian state. However, the Palestinian state have not seen the light yet. So I believe that the Israelis have a problem in trusting the Arabs.
Doubt, sir, but I do have to interrupt you because we only have about 20 more minutes left. I think you're right on to something. You're finished.
I have only this phrase to say. هي تعاونت.
I just wanted to add that this state cooperated with the United States, with the whole world, and the state of Palestine was formed. The national authority was established as a foundation for the establishment of the Palestinian state. And we believe that we, as Arabs and Palestinians, should help Israel to face this fear that they are suffering from.
Things that people, particularly from my generation, which is oddly enough the millennial generation, I'm on the cusp of it still, would say about this conflict is that it isn't as prescient for them as it is for perhaps the older generation. And while it's still certainly a problem, when you have the leadership of Saudi Arabia making great strides, it seems, to really get in bed with the Israelis at this point, one sits back and wonders about the future of this conversation.
Thank you so much. And again, with all due respect to what my dear friend has said, I beg to differ on a number of issues. First of all, the Arab world has recognized Israel's right to exist. The Palestinians themselves have recognized Israel's right to exist. That is not the issue. The issue is that there is an occupation. Is this occupation going to end or not? What more assurances does Israel need than when the whole Arab world, endorsed by 57 members of the Islamic Organization Cooperation, come and say we are willing to guarantee collectively the security for Israel. In order for that to happen, it has to withdraw from Arab lands occupied since 1967 and allow for the emergence of a Palestinian state. This is the issue. Now, if they say they're not comfortable, that is not my problem. The Arab world has been pursuing a path of peace since Barcelona, at least. And remember, the Oslo Agreement was supposed to be crowned by the establishment of a Palestinian state 5 years into the agreement. What did you see after that? We've seen more encroachment on land. We've seen more building of settlements. We've seen more encroachment in positions that are counter to peace. When the Israeli Prime Minister comes and speaks yesterday, and he says he will never allow for Jerusalem to be divided, meaning he will never allow for the East Jerusalem to be the capital of a Palestinian state, as recognized by international law, then that is where the problem is. The problem is not with Arabs giving assurances. The problem is with Israel doing what's right for peace. And what's right for peace is to respect the rights of Palestinians to live in dignity and freedom on their country. From the Arab side, I think the Arab side have done everything it could in order for it to send those assurance messages that we are willing to enter into a peace deal, comprehensive peace deal, with, again, collective security guarantees by the whole Arab world. But for that to happen, Israel has to be part of the region. Israel is in the region, it's not of the region. To be of the region, it has to respect the legitimate rights of Palestinians. And when we speak about conditions on the ground, look at the GDP per capita of Palestinians, $4,000 a year, compared to $40,000 for Israeli. Talk about peace dividend, 25 years into the peace treaty between Jordan and Israel, our trade to the West Bank is a little bit north of $100 million compared to $4 billion of Israeli exports to the West Bank. Now, where is the problem there? Because Israel is not allowing Jordanian goods to go into the West Bank. So again, I think the issue is not Israel being assured about its security. Israel is assured of its security. Israel is a powerful nation. The issue is Israel stopping to continue to uphold to occupying the West Bank and denying Palestinians their right to freedom. So that is, if I may, on that one. On another issue, and I agree totally with Mrs. Sigrid in terms of we have to address the aspirations of our youth. His Majesty was very clear today and has been clear over and over again that we have to do what's right to create jobs, create horizons, create opportunities. But unfortunately, again, the region is interconnected in everything. Let me give you one example. 7 years ago, our economy was growing at about 7%. Now it's growing at under 2%. What happened? The so-called Arab Spring, the crisis that Egypt suffered, and we're glad that it's over it now. That led to the disruption of gas supplies that cost us about $7 billion, which is a huge amount for our economy. What happened? Iraq was our biggest trading partner. We lost it. And Iraq did a great job achieving a huge victory over Daesh, and that's something that they did with tremendous sacrifices. But now, again, long term, we have to stand by Iraq as it seeks to stabilize and reconstruct. What happened is Syria. Syria was our path to Europe. We have 378 kilometers of border with Syria. That means our military has been at a war readiness kind of state to be able to mitigate against danger coming across the border. 1.3 million Syrian refugees. That meant, Jordan gave 136,000 work permits to Syrians. That is 3 times the number of jobs our economy can create on an annual basis. So again, being at the receiving end of every crisis, when we were right on the economic path towards fixing our economy and ensuring its full productivity and effectiveness, we had to deal with the consequences of regional crisis, which meant our reform process had to stop. So again, I totally agree that we have to look at in-house reforms. We have to focus on jobs. We have to focus on education. We have to focus on opportunities. And that is something that we've been doing. But disruptive developments in the region kind of push us back decades ago. And that is what we're suffering from now. We are in the middle now of implementing a very severe austerity economic reform measure with the IMF. And we're committed to it. But again, how could we do it when we have to, again, address the needs of 1.3 million Syrians? And we're grateful for the support we got from the international community. But to be honest, it is not enough. So to come and say for a country with as small as Jordan to be able to deal with all this on its own, it's just not right. We hosted all those refugees because it's the right thing to do. That's Jordan, that's Jordanians. We always do that. But then again, the world has to do the right thing as well and not leave us to suffer the consequences of crises with which we had nothing to create, but of which we're suffering the most as a result. We're dealing with exceptional circumstances, and that means the world approach to us should also be exceptional, taking into account that we are shouldering many of those crises on their behalf. So again, everything is interconnected. Palestinian-Israeli conflict is key. The path to peace is clear. All Arab and Muslim countries have said what they had to say on that. I think now it's up to Israel to do the right thing. Unfortunately, it's not doing the right thing. Actually, it is doing more of the wrong thing by suffocating Palestinians. His Excellency spoke of Israel leaving Gaza, yes, but Gaza is probably, as you've heard it many times, the world's largest prison.
But Minister,
Gaza, but it's suffocated.
We're just a couple of days from the Israeli elections, and it looks more and more likely that Mr. Netanyahu will once again, in some coalition or other, become prime minister yet again of Israel. So do you believe you can work with him?
Look, I mean, I'm not going to comment on what the outcome of the elections are going to be. We'll have to wait and see. But ultimately, again, Jordan will never throw the white towel. We'll continue to do everything we possibly can to make sure that we advance towards what is in the interest of the whole world, which is a comprehensive peace that should be based on, again, fulfilling the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people.
And Minister of Saab, I want to come back to you. And speaking of regional conflicts and the spillover effect there, we were speaking earlier about the Iranian versus Saudi Arabia conflict that seems to be underpinning so much of what's happening in the region today, whether it be, of course, in Syria and Yemen, as well as, of course, in Lebanon as well. You're very much in the crosshairs there. As a government, do you believe that you're able to navigate this effectively, or are we going to continue to see disruption?
I think the Lebanese government is doing its best, and we have succeeded so far to be able to disassociate ourselves from the conflict in the region because it's very complicated. And I still insist that this conflict, to resolve this conflict, you have to go back to the roots. You have to go to the basics. Lebanon is an Arab country, end of the day. And Lebanon will stand by any Arab country according to the Arab League's constitution to defend its sovereignty, its integrity, before we move to talk about any other or third country, whether be it Iran or anybody else. So we are Arabs and we stand by the rights of every Arab country. And probably the audience here, and Hadley, yourself, heard today, really from Minister bin Abdullah, some really wise analyzation of the situation with historic account for what happened in this region. Why am I saying that? Because this probably we belong to different generation. But with Mr. Safadi and myself now, another generation. My children are a third generation. My message, and I don't want to use the term disagree with Minister Safadi, but probably look at it from a different perspective on the situation with Israel. It's not up to the Israelis to understand that the Arabs, with all the visions that we heard today, are united on this. All countries have the same saying vis-a-vis the occupation of the Arab land by Israelis. I think where I differ is it's up to the international community, and I want to go back to the words that were used by Minister bin Abdullah. The international community is who enforced Israel to become what it became. Israel, without the international community, would have not been able to occupy Palestine or the Arab lands, Golan, and even the southern part of Lebanon for a long time, and we still have occupied land until today. It's up to the international community to understand us. It's up to the international community to realize that all the Arabs are going to remain united on that. And they, in turn, can talk to Israel about that. If Israel wants to see peace in the region, it's about time they understand that this is not going to change from any generation until years to come in the future. Things are changing. The balance of power is changing. Maybe at some point we thought the longer we remain, the more land we're going to lose, and Israel is going to get stronger. I see it differently today. Technology have changed things. Media, communication, social media. People in the West, people in Europe, in the United States now are seeing different stories that they weren't seeing before. Things are not going to be to the advantage of the powerful country that is powerful by military anymore. Things are going to change. I do understand that the media have a major role, but I do hope that this panel at least will pass on such strong message to the international community that this Arab world is not in the chaotic situation that it is in without interference by the foreign powers in our countries. When this stops, yes, we will start reforms. We are all fighting for reforms in our countries. Let us do it. Don't enforce it. That's all I have to say.
And so when it comes to, I want to actually bring in Minister Kaag here because we were talking about obviously the recognition of Israel, and we're talking about leadership, frankly. Many would question, certainly in this room, whether or not this process is going to get anywhere with another several years of Mr. Netanyahu in power. Where is the international onus here in terms of pushing this dialogue forward? Because it hasn't worked so far.
No, but I think, to be honest, I think the panel is reducing the question to a very important, sensitive one, and it's about delayed justice and a delayed conclusion in peace negotiations. But if we look at the map of the Middle East today, there are many new crises that are affecting this region as much as the old unresolved issues. So I would beg to differ here. I think many countries, Libya, Syria, Yemen alone, these have their own toxicity, their own set of violations of human rights. It is a regional conflict, first and foremost, with many actors, non-state and state actors. And this you cannot ascribe to anyone else. This you cannot ascribe to history. You can ascribe it to a lack of justice, a lack of governance. You can ascribe it to many things, but not everything is a foreign conspiracy or, let's say, an absence of party A or party B. This is the region in the 21st century, I'm sorry to say. So I think there we need responsibility, political leadership, and accountability. I would argue that this region has too long, and I say this as I've studied, I've lived in the region. I consider myself always one leg in, one leg out. I'm the first voice to always hold a mirror within Europe, but also the other way around is upon friends to also do so. That the accountability towards citizens for oppression or oppressive measures, absence of progress, cannot be ascribed to the post-colonial era. Those days are long gone. So I think we have to also be honest here, and this is where then the European Union may be able to play a role, yes or no. But most of the time it is within the region. The Arab League has never fully come to fruition. I would have wished it had. Many resolutions passed. Yes, the Security Council, we all have views on it, on the votes or the non-compliance with some resolutions. Resolutions adopted, violated, on a large score. But it is, I think, the call for many young people and citizens in this region is for their own leaders, elected leaders or appointed, to take that role and duty. And I think that's extremely important. Europe wants to be helpful, can be helpful. I'm sure in the past we've also been unhelpful. That I'm not suggesting otherwise. But I think the scope and scale is very, very different, particularly with the role of non-state actors financed by state actors, and reverse. The last point, of course, is we haven't yet come to terms with the ideology of Daesh in this case, or ISIS, defeated militarily, but the ideology is not defeated. Why did it come out in a vacuum? How was it financed? Why is it attractive to a small group of young people? And they're not particularly the most illiterate or uneducated. We have the same question in Europe. We have a marginalized group of people that actually packed their bags from democratic countries, citizens that traveled to Syria or Iraq to join a terror organization. These are also questions of marginalization and identity and citizenship. I come back to that. Politics without citizenship or citizenship without political justice will not produce the results that we seek for this region. And there is an intrinsic interest and stability of Europe and this region to actually invest in that. But politics without justice and justice without politics, that won't work. We need to do our part. I concur with that. But leadership has to come from this region.
There's a growing element, though, as well, which is the conflict in the case of nuclear weapons and the conversation surrounding whether or not, with Saudi Arabia's push into nuclear energy and the partners that they're going to choose to do that, whether they be coming from Russia or Europe or the United States, will enforce some kind of accountability there. There are real fears now about an arms race. So we've gone so far beyond even where we were perhaps 10 years ago. Where does Europe stand, do you think, here? Because we've already heard so much pushback from the US Congress. The Trump administration, of course, has been rather cloudy in their assessments of what's actually been happening behind the scenes. Where will Europe stand?
Well, Europe is like Africa. We're not a continent in that sense. We are a continent, but if you're talking European Union, but we have nuclear states within Europe on the continent. We have those that seek to denuclearize. Now, the negotiations in a UN setting have not produced precisely actually because within the Middle East, historically, there was no agreement. We have those who are presumed to have nuclear status but don't declare or don't neither declare nor deny. I think this is going to be very tricky. I think any militarization or risk of militarization in future, albeit for deterrent purposes, is always high risk. So I don't want to presume on the basis of newspaper reporting of whether a country is developing or not. When it comes to Iran, we remain firmly committed to the JCPOA, provided the IAEA confirms each time that Iran is compliant. We see this as a beneficial step. However, if you look at Iran and its investment and its ballistic missile program, which we consider to be a threat to regional stability and security, we have serious concerns on behalf of the European Union.
We only have a few more minutes, and I wanted to take the opportunity to give each of the panelists, we've talked a lot about your concerns about what's happening in the region and also globally, and the influence of external countries, particularly the United States and those in Europe as well, to influence those events. But I want to take a few minutes as we end to give me a positive note of what you see as a positive in the coming year for the Arab region. Minister of Saab.
I am hopeful. I am positive. I think, empowering young people, as we are doing right now, and we should continue to do, will make them think differently and will make the change that is necessary. That's on one hand. So that's why I am hopeful. If it doesn't happen tomorrow, it's going to happen the day after. Sooner or later, the change is going to happen. And I do not disagree with the principles that you've just said, that we need to put in our citizens, the freedom that we should give, respect their rights. We are in agreement on. But what we are in disagreement on, and big time with everybody at the international community today, is the importance of resolving the initial situation, problem, for us to put this behind us and able to look for the future. And we are going to look for the future. The Palestinians are looking for the futures. All the Arab countries are also looking for the future. We have to differentiate. Some countries in the Arab world have made big successes, especially if you look at the Gulf. Look at what happened in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. You see that the future is there. Jordan has come a long way, and Jordan is probably closer to the situation to us in Lebanon. And we are talking with the Jordanians. We are putting, we are, holding hands on a situation that is now forcing crisis in our countries, which is the refugees. The international community should help us to send the refugees back. We took them in our homes, in our schools, in our hospitals. Sigrid was in Lebanon at the time, and she knows what we did to put them in every school, the children where they belong. But these children, most of them now, are lost, they're not out, they're out of school. They're a lost generation, whether we like it or not. We used to say, how can we prevent this from happening? It did happen. And when you have another uneducated group of young people in this region, you're going to expect more problems. It's never too late. We are hopeful because we have partners that we can talk to in Europe, with the United States, with everybody else, but at least let's see eye to eye and realize where the problem is and how can we resolve it. I am hopeful because I listen to many young people in Lebanon talking in that direction. I see many people that are going out, reaching out to international organizations, to NGOs, lobbying here and there, to people in different countries where the decisions are, talking about that. The change will happen. People will start listening more to us, and our communities, our citizens, will look to a better future in that direction. And I am hopeful it will happen.
Yeah, I actually think the theme of the forum gives me hope. And I think from disruptive development, we need to move to the effective use of disruptive technology for justice, inclusive development, and social progress. So I think it's all there. The tools are there. They're known, highly educated population in general, with a focus on those who are marginalized or risk being left behind. I think we can pull this together, but it needs political leadership, will, and the right investments, and Europe needs to assist there, as we will do.
Minister.
Yeah, it's a good talks, and good talks is based on hopes, and hopes has no base. We wish to see this happening. We wish to see that happening. We wish to see this not happening. This is not the life. Today, the world are become very interactive. You should not think that things will come to you. You gave some examples. Dubai, Singapore, Hong Kong. Yes, that's true. But that is not based on the principles we believe in. Ask how much of investment came from Europe to Dubai. But why not coming to Lebanon? Mm-hmm. This is a question to us. Or how much years has been put Singapore in its own economic growth? What is the visions and culture of the Singaporees? Can we try to replicate this in our mind? No, we cannot do this. Because we have a problem here, which is we disagree how to resolve it. And we want the world to resolve it for us. And that is the occupation of the Israelis to the Arab territories. The world are not, they don't want to resolve it for you on your terms. They want to resolve it on their own terms. Now, how long are we going to go in the life? For 70 years. Are we going to add another 70 years without doing nothing? This is the big question.
Thank you. I just would love to know what is the thing that we need to do to get it done. I mean, again, accept the terms means live with occupation, live with failure to give people dignity and respect. I don't think that's a recipe for peace. I think that's a recipe for further conflict. And if I may, again, I totally agree with you, Sigrid, in terms of, change has to come from within. But one is not mutually exclusive. We need to resolve regional conflict. We need to create a whole ecosystem that's conducive to growth. Yeah. But at the same time, we need to improve governance. We need to create political horizons, economic horizons, social horizons. We need to invest in education. We need to empower our youth, our women. Again, as a country with very, very little resources that has been able to survive against all odds and actually create a model, I say our bet is on our people, our bet is on our youth, and I believe that's a successful youth. That has been our history, and that's going to be our future. I think the resilience, creativity, determination, enlightenment of our people is going to guide us through what is a very, very difficult present, but again, we cannot give up, we cannot throw the white towel, we have to go to keep on trying, address regional crises, but at the same time make sure that we move ahead with reforms that are essential, that are happening because we believe in them. And I think, again, our bet is on our people, and I believe that's a successful bet.
Your Excellencies, thank you so much for joining us.